In 1963, in a quiet region of Cappadocia, something small happened that shouldn't have mattered, the kind of thing that happens every day without changing anything at all. A man standing in his basement, annoyed at a draft, or maybe just trying to make more space, lifting a tool and knocking against a wall that had probably stood there longer than his entire family line could remember. And when that wall cracked, it didn't just break, it revealed something, a hollow where there shouldn't have been one, a dark opening where there should have been solid earth. And like anyone would, he looked inside. At first it was just a room, nothing dramatic, just an empty carved space, maybe a storage area from some forgotten time. But then behind that room, there was another, and behind that, another, and then something stranger, a tunnel, not rough and broken like a cave, but shaped, intentional, leading downward into the earth like it had somewhere to go, like it had a purpose. And curiosity is a powerful thing, especially when it feels like you're the first person to see something in centuries. So he stepped inside. He didn't know it yet, but that first step was into something vast, something impossible, something that would later be called Derinkuyu, though at that moment it was just a tunnel, narrow and dim, sloping downward through stone. The air cooler the deeper he went, the light fading behind him, replaced by shadows that swallowed the walls. And still he kept going, down past one level, then another, each step taking him further away from the world he understood, further from sunlight, further from the simple idea of a basement, until it stopped feeling like an extension of a house and started feeling like something else entirely, something older, something deliberate. And when archaeologists eventually came in and mapped it, when they followed those same tunnels and measured every chamber and passage, even they struggled to understand what they were looking at. Because this wasn't just a hidden room or a forgotten cellar. This was a city carved straight down into the earth, nearly 280 feet deep, stretching across 18 separate levels, each one filled with rooms and corridors and systems that made no sense for something built in secret. Thousands of spaces connected by miles of tunnels, ventilation shafts that reached up toward the surface, wells that pulled water from deep underground sources, storage chambers, living quarters, chapels, even places that looked like schools, all of it carved directly into solid volcanic rock with no modern tools, no machinery, no shortcuts, just human effort over time. And that's the first moment where the story stops being simple. Because finding a hidden room is one thing, but finding a city that could hold 20,000 people, that's something else entirely. 20,000 people, not hiding for a night or two, not sheltering from storm, but living, surviving, staying underground for months, maybe even years. And the deeper you think about that, the more unsettling it becomes, because everything about this place suggests permanence, not panic. The ventilation system still works even today. Air flowing through dozens of shafts that run from the surface down to the lowest levels, creating a natural circulation that keeps the entire structure breathable, something that had to be planned from the very beginning, because without it, no one could survive down there for long. And the wells still provide water, tapping into underground aquifers that would have been safe from contamination, safe from anything happening above ground. And then there are the doors. Massive circular stone doors, carved from the same rock as the walls, some weighing up to 1,000 pounds, designed to roll across passages and seal them completely. Not like a door you open and close casually, but like a barrier, something final, something that says once it's shut, it stays shut. And the strange part is they only work from the inside. There's no way to open them from the outside, no handles, no mechanism, nothing. Which means whoever built this wasn't trying to keep people in, they were trying to keep something out. And that's where the question starts to grow, the one that sits at the center of everything, the one that doesn't have a clear answer no matter how much you study the site or the history around it. Because it's not just about how they built it, though that alone is difficult to explain, it's about why. Why carve an entire city into solid rock? Why go down 18 levels instead of just 1 or 2? Why build it to support thousands of people for extended periods of time? Why design doors that seal from the inside and trap you underground once they're closed? What kind of threat makes that seem like the safer option? The usual explanation is invasion. And on the surface, that makes sense because this region has seen its share of armies over the centuries. The Hittites, the Persians, the Romans, later the Arabs, even the Mongols, waves of conflict passing through, forcing people to adapt, to survive however they could, and having a place to hide would be useful. But here's the problem with that explanation. You don't build something like this for occasional danger. Raids happen quickly. They pass through, they take what they can carry and move on. They don't stick around long enough to justify carving an entire underground world. And if your only goal is to survive a short attack, you don't need 18 levels, you don't need miles of tunnels, you don't need ventilation systems that could sustain thousands of people indefinitely. You could hide in caves. You could retreat to the mountains. You could run. This is different. This is what you build when running isn't an option, when hiding has to be complete, when disappearing underground isn't a temporary solution, but a repeated necessity, something you expect to do again and again, generation after generation. And Derinkuyu isn't alone. That's another detail that changes everything, because once archaeologists started looking, they didn't just find one underground city. They found dozens across Cappadocia, smaller ones, larger ones, some connected by long tunnels that stretch for miles, creating networks beneath the surface, entire pathways where you could travel from one place to another without ever seeing the sky. It's not just a structure, it's a system, an entire underground way of life. And the deeper you go into that idea, the harder it is to dismiss, because it suggests something bigger than a single event, bigger than a single threat, something that shaped the behavior of entire communities, forcing them to invest unimaginable amounts of time and effort into creating a world below ground. And that brings you back to the beginning, to that man in 1963, standing in his basement, breaking through a wall without knowing what was behind it, without knowing he was uncovering something that would raise more questions than answers, something that would make historians and archaeologists rethink what people in the ancient world were capable of, not just in terms of engineering, but in terms of fear. Because fear leaves traces, not always in written records, not always in stories passed down, but in the things people build, in the choices they make when they believe something is coming, something they can't stop, something they can only prepare for. And Derinkuyu feels like preparation. Not rushed, not chaotic, but careful, deliberate, planned over generations, refined and expanded as time went on, each level adding complexity, each passage serving a purpose, every detail pointing toward one idea, survival at any cost. Even if that cost is leaving the surface behind. Even if that cost is raising children who grow up in darkness, who learn to navigate tunnels instead of open fields, who understand the layout of an underground maze better than the world above it. And when you think about that, really think about it. It changes how you see the place because it's no longer just an archaeological site. It's not just an impressive piece of ancient engineering. It's a response. A response to something we don't fully understand. Something that made people decide that the safest place to live was buried deep inside the earth. And the deeper we go into this story, the more that question is going to matter, because everything about Derinkuyu, every tunnel, every door, every carefully carved room, points back to it. What were they so afraid of that this made sense? And once you sit with that question, once it really settles in your mind, the fear behind it, the scale of it, something else starts to take over, something just as unsettling in a different way. Because even if you accept that they had a reason, even if you imagine a threat so constant, so unavoidable that living underground made sense, there's still another problem waiting underneath all of it, something far more practical, far more immediate. How do they actually build this? Not in theory, not in a simplified explanation, but in reality, step by step, day by day, with the tools they had at the time. Because when you strip away the mystery and just look at the physical work involved, Derinkuyu stops feeling like a city and starts feeling like an impossibility. This isn't digging a hole. This isn't carving out a small shelter or expanding a natural cave. This is removing millions of cubic feet of solid rock, shaping it, refining it, turning it into something organized and functional, all without modern equipment, without explosives, without power tools, without even the kind of precision instruments we take for granted today. The rock itself tells part of the story. The region of Cappadocia is formed from volcanic material, layers of ash that compressed over time into something called tuff. And on the surface, that sounds helpful because tuff is softer than many other types of rock, easier to carve when you first cut into it, almost workable in a way that granite or basalt isn't. But softer doesn't mean soft. It's still stone. It still resists every strike. Every inch has to be chipped away, piece by piece, with tools that wear down, with hands that tire, with time that stretches endlessly forward as the work continues. Now imagine doing that not for a single room, but for an entire city. Derinkuyu goes nearly 280 feet down, 18 levels deep, spreading across an area that covers miles of passages and chambers. And when researchers try to estimate how much material was removed, even conservative numbers land somewhere around 2.5 million cubic feet of rock. Try to picture that, not as a number, but as something physical, something real. That's mountains of stone. That's endless loads of debris that had to be cut, broken, carried, and somehow taken away, because one of the strangest details in all of this isn't just how much rock was removed, it's that we don't know where it went. There are no massive piles of discarded stone sitting nearby. No obvious dumping grounds. No ancient quarries filled with leftover material from the excavation. It's just gone, which leaves you with two options, and neither of them feels reasonable. Either they transported it, carrying load after load up narrow passages, out to the surface, and then moving it far enough away that no trace remains, or they broke it down further, grinding it, scattering it, spreading it so thin across the landscape that it disappeared into the environment. Both possibilities require an amount of labor that's hard to even describe. Not hundreds of workers, not thousands working briefly, but generations, entire communities dedicating their lives to a project that had no immediate reward, something they wouldn't even see completed in their own lifetime. And even that only explains the digging. Because they didn't just dig. They carved. Every wall inside Derinkuyu is shaped, smooth, refined into curves and surfaces that feel intentional. Ceilings arched to prevent collapse. Columns left standing where support was needed. Steps cut directly into the stone and narrow stairways that wind between levels. This isn't random excavation. This is architecture. And architecture requires planning. You don't just start digging and hope it works out. You need to know where you're going, how deep you can go without weakening the structure, how to distribute weight, how to prevent collapse, how to ensure that the spaces you create can actually be used. And they did all of this underground, in darkness. That's the part that's easy to overlook but impossible to ignore once you focus on it, because none of this work was done in open air, under sunlight, with clear visibility. The deeper they went, the darker it became. At 50 feet, there's no natural light. At 100 feet, you're completely cut off. At 200 feet, you're working in a space where the only illumination comes from oil lamps or torches, small flickering flames that barely push back the darkness, that fill the air with smoke, that make breathing harder with every passing hour. And in that environment, they were expected to carve precise shapes into rock. Straight lines, smooth curves, perfectly aligned passages. It's hard enough to do that today, with electric lighting and modern tools. Doing it in those conditions changes everything. Every mistake matters more. Every miscalculation could mean weakening a wall, causing a collapse, trapping workers underground. And yet, the city stands. Not just standing, but stable, functional, still intact after thousands of years. Which means they didn't just manage the risk, they mastered it. And nowhere is that more obvious than in the ventilation system. Because before you can build anything underground at that scale, before you can even think about housing thousands of people, you need air. Not a little bit of air, not enough for a few workers, but a continuous, reliable flow that reaches every level, every chamber, every passage. Derinkuyu has more than 50 ventilation shafts. Some of them stretch over 180 feet from the surface down to the lower levels. Narrow vertical tunnels carved straight through rock, roughly 3 feet wide, perfectly aligned so that air can move freely from top to bottom. And here's the problem with that. You can't dig a vertical shaft from the bottom up. You have to start from the surface and work your way down. But if you're digging straight down, how do you remove the debris? How do you get tools to the workers below? How do you keep the shaft from collapsing as it gets deeper and deeper? And most importantly, how do you ensure it ends up exactly where it needs to be? Because these shafts aren't random. They connect to specific parts of the city. They align with passages and chambers that were carved later, which means whoever started digging them had to know in advance where everything else would be. Think about that. Before the city existed, before the rooms were carved, before the tunnels were shaped, someone stood on the surface and decided where to place these shafts, how deep to make them, how they would connect to a structure that hadn't even been built yet. And then they started digging. Blind. No guarantee it would work. No way to see what they were aiming for. Just faith in a plan that had to be right the first time. Because if it wasn't, if a shaft ended up in the wrong place, if it didn't connect properly, if it failed to provide enough airflow, the entire project could fail with it. And yet it didn't. The shafts work. Even now, air moves through them, rising and falling naturally as temperatures shift, creating a system that doesn't rely on anything mechanical, something that just continues to function because it was designed correctly from the beginning. And then there's the water. Because air keeps you alive, but water keeps you going. Without it, none of this matters. And just like with the ventilation, the water system in Derinkuyu isn't something you figure out as you go. It has to be planned, integrated into the structure from the start, because once you're underground, you can't just decide later to add a well and hope it works. You either find water or you don't. And if you don't, everything else becomes useless. The wells in Derinkuyu go deep. Some of them over 180 feet. Narrow shafts cut straight down until they reach underground aquifers, sources of water hidden beneath layers of rock, invisible from the surface, impossible to locate without some understanding of the land, some knowledge of where to dig and how far to go. And here's what makes that so strange. Every well works. They didn't miss. They didn't dig in the wrong place and try again somewhere else. They found water consistently across multiple levels, integrating those wells into the layout of the city in a way that suggests planning, not trial and error. Which raises another question. How do they know where the water was? Because you can't see an aquifer. You can't hear it from the surface. You can't just guess and hope to be right when the cost of being wrong is months or years of wasted effort. And yet they got it right. Again and again. It's the kind of thing that suggests experience, accumulated knowledge passed down over time, refined through generations, something that goes beyond basic survival and moves into something closer to expertise. And the deeper you go into that idea, the more it changes how you see the builders of this place, because they weren't just laborers working blindly. They were planners, engineers, people who understood their environment in ways that feel advanced even now. They knew how rock behaves. They knew how air moves. They knew how water flows. And they used that knowledge to create something that still works today. Not partially, not in theory, but physically, functionally as a system. And that's where the real weight of it settles in. Because this wasn't luck. It wasn't accidental. It wasn't something that happened quickly or carelessly. It was intentional, precise, and built to last. Which means every tunnel, every shaft, every well, every carefully carved room is part of a larger design, something that existed in someone's mind long before it existed in the ground. And that brings you back, once again, to the same place this story keeps returning to. If they were capable of this, if they could plan something this complex, execute it with such precision, maintain it over generations, then whatever drove them to do it must have been just as real, just as powerful, just as impossible to ignore. Because people don't commit to something like this without reason. Not this much effort, not this much time, not this much sacrifice. They knew something, or they experienced something that made all of this necessary. And whatever that was, it had to be worth carving a city out of the earth itself. And once you understand how they built it, once you accept that somehow, over time, with enough knowledge and effort, a city like Derinkuyu could exist beneath the surface, the next layer of the story starts to reveal something even more unsettling. Because building a place is one thing, but sustaining life inside it, truly sustaining it, is something else entirely. And everything comes back to one thing. Water. Not food, not shelter, not even light, water, because without it, nothing else matters, and whoever designed this place understood that in a way that feels almost obsessive, like they weren't just planning for survival. They were planning for isolation, complete and total separation from the world above. Because the water system here isn't simple. It's not just a well dug into the ground. It's a network, a carefully designed system that reaches through multiple levels, connecting different parts of the city in ways that suggest control, not just access. And the deeper you look at it, the more it stops feeling like a convenience and starts feeling like a necessity. The main well shaft runs from the surface all the way down, a vertical line cutting through nearly 280 feet of rock, narrow, precise, almost perfectly straight, like someone drew a line from top to bottom and then made it real. And along that shaft, at different levels, smaller channels branch out, carved into the walls, sloping just enough to let water flow naturally without stagnating. Each level has its own access points, its own basins, its own way of collecting and storing water, which means no single point of failure, no single place where everything depends on one connection. If something goes wrong in one section, the others still function. That's not accidental. That's design. That's someone thinking ahead, asking what happens if this part fails, what happens if we lose access here, how do we keep going, how do we survive longer than expected. And then you notice something else. The water is protected, not just physically, but strategically. Because the wells don't rely on surface sources, they don't pull from rivers or lakes or anything exposed. They tap into underground aquifers, water that's been filtered through layers of rock, water that never sees the surface, water that can't easily be contaminated from above. And that changes everything. Because if you're just hiding from a raid, if you're ducking underground for a few days while danger passes, you don't need that. You bring water with you. You store it in containers. You ration it. You wait. But this system isn't built for waiting a few days. It's built for staying. For weeks. For months. Maybe longer. And that's where the questions start to get heavier. Because once you accept that people weren't just hiding here temporarily, once you accept that they expected to remain underground for extended periods, you have to ask why. What kind of situation forces that? Because even a siege doesn't quite explain it. Ancient armies didn't have the logistics to surround a hidden underground city for months on end, especially one that didn't rely on surface water, that didn't depend on outside supplies, that could effectively disappear and wait. Sieges are expensive. They require time, resources, coordination. You don't commit to that unless there's something worth taking, and an underground population hiding behind sealed stone doors doesn't offer much. So if it's not a typical siege, then what is it? Because the water system suggests something different. Something longer. Something unpredictable. Something that might not follow the normal rules of conflict. And then you start noticing the details that most people overlook. The channels that connect different levels aren't just for distribution. They can be controlled, blocked, redirected. Small stone plugs could shut off water to certain areas, isolate sections of the city, prevent contamination from spreading. That's not just engineering. That's strategy. That's someone thinking about what happens if part of the system becomes unsafe, if something enters the water, if one section has to be sacrificed to protect the rest. That's containment thinking. And containment implies a different kind of threat, not something you fight directly, something you manage. Something you avoid. Something you keep away from yourself at all costs. And when you connect that idea to what we know about ancient societies, to the records that do exist, a pattern starts to emerge. Because across different cultures, across different regions, there are repeated references to something that doesn't behave like an army. Disease, plagues, contamination, invisible threats that spread through water, through contact, through the environment itself. Things you can't see coming, things you can't fight with weapons, things that don't stop when you close a gate or raise a wall. And suddenly, the water system in Derinkuyu starts to make a different kind of sense. Not just as a source of survival, but as a barrier, a way to separate yourself completely from the outside world. Because if the surface becomes dangerous, not because of people, but because of something in the environment, something in the water, something in the air, then going underground isn't just hiding. It's isolating. It's creating a controlled space where you decide what comes in and what stays out. And the deeper wells, the ones that reach untouched aquifers, become more than just a convenience. They become the only safe option. Water that has never been exposed. Water that hasn't been touched by whatever is happening above. And the storage capacity supports that idea. Because there are large chambers near the wells, spaces designed to hold significant amounts of water, not just for daily use, but for long-term reserves, enough to sustain thousands of people without needing to reopen connections to the surface. That's not preparation for a short-term emergency. That's preparation for something that could last. Something you don't want to interact with until it's completely gone. And then there's the positioning of the wells themselves. They aren't random. They hit water at different depths on different levels, which means whoever planned this understood the geology of the region, understood where the aquifers were likely to be, how deep to dig, how to align the system so that it would function reliably across the entire city. That's knowledge. Detailed, specific knowledge. The kind you build over time, through observation, through experience, through repeated interaction with the land. And that brings you back to the idea that this wasn't built quickly. This wasn't a reaction to a single event. This was developed, refined, improved across generations, each one adding something new, making the system stronger, more reliable, more resilient. Because whatever they were dealing with didn't go away. It came back, again and again. And each time they adapted, improved, prepared better for the next time. And that's where the water system becomes more than just an engineering feature. It becomes evidence. Evidence of how they thought, how they prioritized survival, how they understood risk. Because water is the first thing you secure when you're planning for isolation. It's the first thing you protect when you're trying to separate yourself from danger. And everything about this system suggests that they expect it to be cut off. Completely. No contact with the surface. No reliance on outside sources. Just a closed environment, sustained from within, protected from whatever existed beyond those stone walls. And that idea, more than anything else, changes the way you see the entire city. Because it's no longer just a refuge. It's not just a place you run to when something goes wrong. It's a place you disappear into. A place designed to function independently. A place where life continues, even when the world above becomes unsafe. And when you combine that with everything else, the ventilation, the storage, the layout, the defensive features, it all starts to point in the same direction. Long-term survival. Not hiding. Living. Waiting. Enduring. Until whatever is happening outside stops. Or fades. Or becomes safe again. And that raises a final thought that's hard to ignore once it forms. Because if they went to this level of detail, if they built systems this advanced, this resilient, this carefully planned, then they must have believed one thing above all else. That whatever they were protecting themselves from could last longer than they could afford to be unprepared. And once you understand the water, once you see how deeply they planned for survival, for isolation, for the possibility of staying underground far longer than anyone would want to imagine, the next detail comes into focus. And this is the one that changes the feeling of the entire place, because up until now, you could still tell yourself this was about safety, about caution, about preparation. But the moment you really look at the doors, that idea starts to shift into something else entirely. Because the doors don't feel like safety. They feel like fear. Real, practiced, repeated fear, the kind that doesn't fade with time, the kind that forces people to build not just barriers, but systems of defense so complete that once they're activated, there's no easy way back. Inside Derinkuyu, these doors are everywhere. Not just at the entrances, not just at the surface level where you'd expect a defensive structure to focus its strength, but deep inside, between levels, between sections, at key junctions where movement can be controlled, where access can be restricted, where entire parts of the city can be cut off from the rest. They're massive. Circular slabs of stone, some 5 feet across, thick, heavy, weighing hundreds, sometimes over 1,000 pounds, carved with precision so that they fit perfectly into grooves cut into the floor, allowing them to roll into place and seal off a passage completely. And when they're closed, that's it. No gaps, No weak points, just solid rock blocking the way. But what matters isn't just how strong they are. It's how they work. Because every single one of these doors is designed to be operated from the inside only. There are no handles on the outside, no mechanism you can reach, no way to pull or push or force it open unless you're already inside the protected space. From the outside, it's just a wall. And that tells you something important. This wasn't meant to be a fortress you defend while moving in and out freely. This was meant to be a place you retreat into and then seal behind you. Completely. Which means the moment those doors roll shut, you're making a decision. You're choosing to cut yourself off from the surface, from sunlight, from fresh air beyond what your ventilation system can provide, from everything you know, and you're trusting that whatever is outside is worse than being trapped inside. That's not a casual choice. That's not something you do for a minor threat. That's something you do when you believe staying outside is no longer an option. And the placement of these doors makes that even clearer. The first one isn't far from the entrance. About 50 feet in, close enough that once people enter, they can seal it quickly, creating an immediate barrier between themselves and whatever might be following. Then deeper, another, and another, and another, layer after layer, each one further isolating the inner parts of the city, each one buying more time, more distance, more protection. It's not just a single line of defense. It's a system of retreat, a plan for what happens when the first barrier fails, and the second, and maybe even the third. Because the deeper you go, the stronger the doors become. Heavier, thicker, better reinforced. The ones near the surface are functional. The ones further down feel permanent, like they were built with the expectation that if something gets that far, nothing can be allowed through. Some of them even have additional features, secondary locking mechanisms, grooves for wooden beams or stone bars that can be dropped into place, reinforcing the seal, making it even harder to move. And again, all of this is done underground, in darkness, with limited tools, which means every one of these doors represents not just effort, but intention, careful design, precise execution, and a clear understanding of how they would be used. Because these doors weren't theoretical. They weren't built just in case. They show signs of wear. Grooves in the tracks where they've been rolled back and forth. Polished surfaces where stone has moved against stone over time. Marks that tell you this wasn't a one-time event. They were used again and again, which means whatever they were protecting themselves from didn't happen once. It happened repeatedly, often enough that maintaining these doors, keeping them functional, keeping the tracks clear, became part of life. Part of routine. Something passed down through generations. And that's where it starts to feel different. Because now you're not just looking at a defensive structure. You're looking at a habit, a learned behavior, something people expected to do. Enter the city, move past the first door, seal it, go deeper, seal again, layer by layer, retreating further underground, isolating themselves more completely each time. And the deeper you go, the more serious it becomes. Some of the lower level doors are positioned in ways that suggest they were meant to protect specific areas, living quarters, communal spaces, places where people would gather for long periods, where safety mattered most. And near these doors, you find something else. Small chambers, guard posts, spaces carved into the walls where someone could sit, wait, watch. There are benches, niches for oil lamps, places where weapons could be stored, which means someone had a job, to stay there, in the dark, watching a sealed stone door, waiting, listening, ready to react if something tried to come through. Think about that for a moment. Sitting underground, behind a barrier that weighs half a ton, knowing that on the other side, there's something you don't want to face, something you're prepared to defend against if it somehow breaks through. What kind of threat requires that level of vigilance? Because it's not just about strength. It's about persistence. The doors don't just stop something once. They're designed to hold for as long as necessary, to keep something out indefinitely. And the design supports that idea. There's a small hole in the center of each door, just wide enough to pass a spear through. From inside, you could defend the doorway without opening it. Anyone trying to force it from the outside becomes exposed. But from the outside, there's no way to use that same feature. It's one-sided. All advantage goes to the people inside. And that's not how you design something for dealing with normal enemies. Because if this were about armies, about human attackers, the strategy would be different. You want ways to counterattack, ways to push back, ways to reclaim space. But here, everything is about holding, about sealing, about enduring, which suggests the goal wasn't to defeat whatever was outside. It was to survive it, to outlast it, to wait until it was gone. And that's where the doors start to feel less like a defense against people and more like a barrier against something else. Something that doesn't give up easily. Something that might wait. Something that might come back. Because if you think about it, if you were hiding from raiders, from armies passing through, you wouldn't need this level of commitment. They take what they want. They move on. They don't spend days trying to break into sealed underground chambers with no clear reward. But these doors are built as if whatever is outside will keep trying. We'll keep pushing. We'll keep searching. And that's why each level can be isolated. Why each section can be sacrificed if necessary. Because survival doesn't mean saving everything. It means saving what you can. And that idea becomes even clearer when you notice something else. Some doors are positioned in ways that trap whoever is on the wrong side. If you're caught between two sealed sections, there's no easy way out. You're cut off, alone, which means the system doesn't just protect. It divides. It isolates. It forces choices. Who gets through? Who doesn't? And that's not something you build lightly. That's something you build when you know there will be moments where not everyone can be saved. And yet, despite all of that, despite the weight, the complexity, the intention behind every detail, these doors still work. Even now, archaeologists have cleared some of them, tested them, and after thousands of years, they can still be moved, still roll into place, still seal the passages they were designed to block. Which means the system hasn't failed. It hasn't degraded beyond use. It's still there, waiting, and that's the part that stays with you. Because it means this wasn't just a relic of the past. It's not something that only made sense in a different time. If you needed it to, if something happened that made it necessary, you could still use it. You could still go underground, still close those doors, still rely on the same systems that people built thousands of years ago. And that brings everything back to the same thought, the one that keeps repeating no matter which part of the city you look at, the one that ties together the engineering, the water, the layout, and now the doors. They were ready, not once, not briefly, but continuously. Prepared for something they believed would return, something they never fully escaped. And whatever that was, it shaped every part of this place. And once you pass those doors, once you imagine them closing behind you, sealing off the last connection to the surface, to light, to anything familiar, the next thing you notice isn't the rooms or the scale or even the silence. It's the passages themselves, because this is where Derinkuyu stops feeling like a refuge and starts feeling like something far more deliberate, something designed not just to protect, but to control, to confuse, to turn the environment itself into a weapon. The tunnels are not comfortable. They're not wide or open or easy to move through. Most of them are narrow, barely 3 feet across in places, low enough that you can't stand upright, forcing you to bend forward, your shoulders brushing against the stone, your head constantly aware of the ceiling just inches above you. That alone changes how you move, slows you down, tires you out, and it does something else, something subtle but important. It takes away your confidence. Because when you can't stand straight, when you can't move freely, you feel smaller, weaker, more vulnerable. And that matters, because this space wasn't just built for living. It was built with conflict in mind, measured, like someone decided exactly how you should move, where you should slow down, where you should hesitate, where you should make mistakes. The ceilings shift constantly. One moment you're crouched, the next you're forced even lower, almost crawling, then suddenly it opens up again just enough to stand, only to drop back down a few steps later. There's no rhythm to it, no pattern you can adjust to. And that's not accidental. When you can't find a rhythm, you can't move quickly. You can't build momentum. You're always adjusting, always reacting, always slightly off balance. And in a place like this, being off balance is dangerous. Because you're not alone. Even if you don't see anyone, Even if the tunnels feel empty, the design assumes something important. Someone else knows this place better than you do. Someone who doesn't need to think about where they're going. Someone who can move through these passages in complete darkness, by memory, by instinct. While you're still trying to understand the layout, still trying to figure out which turn leads where, they're already behind you, or above you, or waiting just out of sight. The turns come quickly. Sharp corners every few steps. You can't see more than a few feet ahead at any given time. No long sight lines. No open spaces where you can assess your surroundings. Every corner is a blind spot. Every step forward is a guess. And that creates tension, because you don't know what's coming. You don't know what's waiting. And that uncertainty builds with every turn. There are small recesses carved into the walls. At first glance, they look like storage spaces, places to hold lamps or tools, but then you realize their size, their shape, just large enough for a person to stand inside. Hidden from view, pressed into the stone, waiting. You walk past one of these without noticing, and suddenly someone steps out behind you, in a narrow passage where you can barely turn around, where you can't swing a weapon properly, where your options are limited to panic or retreat. And retreat isn't easy either, because the passages don't just twist. They change elevation. Some slope downward unexpectedly. Others climb in uneven steps carved directly into the rock. And those steps aren't uniform. They're irregular. Different heights, different depths. You can't trust your footing. You have to watch where you place your feet, which means you're not watching ahead. You're not watching for danger. You're distracted. And distraction, in a place like this, is all it takes. There are vertical shafts cutting through the tunnels. Ventilation passages that connect different levels. From above, something can be dropped down without warning. A stone, boiling water, anything. You're walking below, focused on the path ahead, and suddenly something falls from the darkness above, and there's nothing you can do about it. No time to react. Nowhere to block it. The space is too tight. The movement too restricted. And even if you try to climb those shafts, to use them as a way out, they're too narrow, too smooth, impossible to grip properly. They're not escape routes. They're vulnerabilities. For you, not for the people who built this place. Because they knew exactly where those shafts were. Exactly how to use them. There are openings in the ceilings in some sections. Small holes, barely noticeable unless you're looking for them. From above, someone can reach down. A spear thrust through the darkness. You wouldn't see it coming. You wouldn't even know someone was there. And that's the pattern. Everything about these passages removes your advantages and gives them to someone else. Someone who understands the space. Someone who planned it. Even the sound works against you. In an open environment, you can tell where noise is coming from. You can judge distance, direction. But underground, in narrow stone tunnels, sound behaves differently. It echoes, bounces, twists. You hear footsteps, but you can't tell if they're ahead of you or behind you, above or below, closer or farther away. Voices carry in strange ways. A whisper can sound like it's right next to you. A shout can seem distant. And that confusion builds tension. It makes you second-guess every decision, every step. You start reacting to things that aren't there, or missing things that are. And then there are the dead ends. Passages that look promising, that seem to lead somewhere important, until they don't, until they just stop. Solid wall, nothing beyond. Now you have to turn around, go back the way you came. And in that moment, you're exposed. Because now you're moving through a space you've already passed through, but this time, it's different. Because now you're thinking about what might be behind you, what might have followed you in, what might be waiting at the next turn. And the deeper you go, the worse it gets. The passages become tighter, more complex, more disorienting. You're further from the surface, further from any sense of direction. Time starts to blur. There's no natural light to guide you. No clear sense of up or down beyond the slope of the tunnel beneath your feet. And that does something to your mind. You start to lose your bearings, start to feel trapped. And that feeling builds slowly but steadily, until it becomes something harder to ignore. Because this place isn't just physically restrictive. It's psychologically overwhelming. It wears you down, not all at once, but over time, step by step, turn by turn, until you're exhausted, mentally and physically. And that's when mistakes happen. That's when people panic. And panic in a place like this is dangerous. Because panic makes you rush, makes you ignore the details, makes you forget to watch your footing, to listen carefully, to think clearly. And once you lose that control, the environment takes over. The design takes over. Every narrow passage, every uneven step, every hidden recess, every blind corner, they all work together. Not randomly, not accidentally, but as part of a system designed to make sure that if someone enters this city with hostile intent, they don't make it far. They don't reach the deeper levels. They don't find the people hiding below. And when you look at it that way, when you step back and see the pattern, it becomes clear. This wasn't just a place to hide. It was a place to defend. A place where the terrain itself becomes the weapon. Where the architecture does the fighting for you. Where you don't need large numbers or heavy weapons. You just need knowledge, position, patience. And whoever built this understood that completely. They understood how to control movement, how to create choke points, how to turn simple spaces into deadly ones. And they applied that knowledge everywhere. In every tunnel, in every turn, in every step you take. And the most unsettling part is that it still works. Nothing about this design depends on time or technology. It doesn't matter if it's ancient or modern. If you walked into those tunnels today without knowing the layout, without understanding the design, you would face the same challenges, the same confusion, the same vulnerability, because the system doesn't change. The stone doesn't forget. And that means this place wasn't just built for a specific moment in history. It was built to function the same way, no matter when it was used. Which brings you back, again, to the same thought that keeps following this story from the beginning. They didn't just prepare for danger. They perfected their response to it. And they built that response into the very ground beneath their feet. And after everything we've gone through, the scale, the engineering, the defenses, the tunnels that feel more like traps than pathways, there's one part of this story that's easy to overlook, but once you think about it, it becomes the hardest part to ignore because beyond all the stone and design and strategy, there were people here. Real people. Families. Children. Elders. Entire communities who didn't just pass through Derinkuyu, they lived in it. And living underground, not for a few hours or even a few days, but for weeks, maybe months at a time, changes everything. It changes how you think, how you feel, how you understand the world. Because the moment those doors closed, the moment the last bit of surface light disappeared, everything familiar was gone. No eskai, no hiraisen, no sun rising or setting to tell you when a new day begins. Just darkness, broken only by the small, flickering light of oil lamps, shadows moving across stone walls, never still, never steady, always shifting just enough to make the space feel alive in a way that isn't comforting. At the upper levels, maybe a hint of natural light filtered through, faint and distant. But the deeper you went, the more complete the darkness became, until there was nothing left of the outside world at all. And humans aren't built for that. We rely on light more than we realize. Not just to see, but to regulate everything inside us, our sleep, our energy, our sense of time, our mood, our ability to stay grounded in reality. Take that away, and things start to change. Slowly at first. You lose track of time. Days blend together. Without sunrise or sunset, there's nothing to anchor you, nothing to tell your body when to wake or when to rest. You sleep when you're tired. You wake when you can. And over time, that rhythm drifts, becomes unpredictable, disjointed. Some people might stay awake longer than they should. Others might sleep too much. And eventually, the sense of day and night just disappears. And that's not just uncomfortable. It's disorienting. It affects your thinking, your emotions, your ability to focus. Even today, when people spend extended time in caves or isolated environments, they report the same thing: confusion, fatigue, a strange detachment from reality. Like the world outside has become distant, almost unreal. Now imagine that, not for one person, but for thousands. Families try to maintain some sense of normal life in a place where normal doesn't exist anymore. Parents trying to create routines for their children, telling them when it's time to eat, when it's time to rest, when it's time to learn, even though those concepts have lost their natural meaning. Because they had to try. They had to create structure where there was none. And we know they tried because of what's been found inside the city. There are rooms that look like classrooms, benches carved from stone, spaces where children likely gathered, where lessons were taught, where someone stood at the front and tried to bring a sense of order to a world that had been turned upside down. There are chapels, places of worship, where people gathered not just for ritual, but for comfort, for hope, for something to hold on to when everything else felt uncertain. And then there are the living spaces. Small, enclosed rooms where families stayed together, where they slept, talked, argued, waited. Because waiting becomes a central part of life underground. Waiting for news. Waiting for silence above. Waiting for a signal that it's safe to return. And not knowing how long that wait will be. That uncertainty builds. Every hour, every day, you start to listen for things. Footsteps above. Distant sounds filtering through layers of rock. Trying to interpret them. Trying to decide if they mean danger or safety. And sometimes there's nothing. Just silence. And silence, in a place like that, isn't always comforting. Because silence can mean the threat is still there. Or it can mean something worse. That there's no one left. That the world above has changed in ways you don't understand. And while all of that is happening, life continues. Because it has to. People still eat. Still work. Still take care of animals kept in lower levels. Goats, sheep, maybe chickens, their sounds echoing through the tunnels, adding another layer of noise to a place already filled with it. And noise is another thing that changes underground. There's no soft ground, no trees, no open space to absorb sound. Everything echoes. Footsteps bounce off the walls. Voices carry further than you expect. A simple conversation in one room can be heard in another. And that creates tension, because privacy becomes rare. Everything feels closer, more intense. Small disagreements can grow. Frustrations build, because there's nowhere to go to escape them. No outside, no distance, just the same enclosed space over and over again. And then there's the air. Even with the ventilation system, even with the shafts bringing in fresh air from above, it's not the same. There's always the smell of oil from lamps, the presence of smoke, the dampness of earth, the closeness of so many people living together. Over time, you get used to it, but that doesn't mean it's easy. Some days, breathing might feel heavier, especially deeper down, where the air is still moving, but not as freely. And all of that affects the body. Without sunlight, the body can't produce enough vitamin D. Bones weaken, muscles ache, energy drops. Children, especially, would feel this. Growing bodies need light. Without it, development slows. Health suffers. And then there's food. Stored in large quantities, grains, dried fruits, preserved meat, enough to last, but not enough to feel abundant. Meals become repetitive, simple, predictable, and over time, that wears on people too. Not just physically, but mentally. Because food isn't just fuel. It's comfort. It's variety. It's something to look forward to. And when that disappears, when every meal feels the same, something small but important is lost. And in that environment, even small losses matter. They add up, piece by piece, day by day, until the weight of it becomes something you carry all the time. And then there's illness. Because when you put large numbers of people together in enclosed spaces, sickness spreads. Quickly, a cough becomes many coughs. A fever moves from one person to another. And without modern medicine, without the ability to isolate effectively, even minor illnesses can become serious. The air doesn't clear things away like it does on the surface. There's no sunlight to help reduce bacteria. Everything lingers longer. And yet, despite all of that, people stayed. They endured it, because whatever was outside was worse. That's the part that matters most. Because humans can adapt to a lot. We can survive in difficult conditions. We can adjust to discomfort, to uncertainty, even to fear. But we don't choose those conditions unless the alternative is something we fear more. And that's what Derinkuyu represents. A choice. Not a good one. Not an easy one. But the best option available at the time. A place where life could continue, even if it wasn't the life people wanted. Even if it meant raising children who grew up without ever seeing the sky for months at a time. Even if it meant elders spending their final days underground, cut off from the world they once knew. And when you think about that, when you imagine waking up in that darkness, lighting a small lamp just to see the space around you, hearing the distant sounds of others moving through the tunnels, realizing that this is your world now, at least for a while, it changes how you see the entire city. Because it's not just an engineering marvel. It's not just a defensive structure. It's a lived experience. A difficult one. A heavy one. A constant balance between survival and endurance. And every carved wall, every narrow passage, every hidden room carries that history with it. Not just of how it was built, but of how it was used. How it felt. What it meant to the people who depended on it. And all of that brings us closer to the final layer of this story. Because once you understand how they lived, the question of why becomes even harder to ignore. And when you step back from all of it, the engineering, the water systems, the doors, the tunnels, the way people lived and endured in the darkness beneath Derinkuyu, you reach a point where all the details stop feeling separate and start connecting into something bigger, something that isn't written down anywhere clearly, something that wasn't left behind in words, but is still there, built into the stone itself. Because this place tells a story, not directly, not in a way that gives you a simple answer, but in patterns, in decisions, in the sheer amount of effort that went into solving problems most people would never even imagine facing. And when you follow those patterns all the way through, one idea keeps coming back, no matter how you try to explain it away. This wasn't built for a single moment. It wasn't built in response to one invasion, one war, one disaster. It was built for repetition, for something that kept happening, something that people expected to return, again and again, because everything here supports that. The layers of defense that assume failure and retreat. The water systems that assume long-term isolation. The storage spaces that assume extended absence from the surface. The living quarters that assume life continuing underground. Not just survival, but routine, structure, community. Even the tunnels, designed not just to slow intruders, but to break them down over time, to wear them out, to make reaching the inner levels nearly impossible. You don't design all of that unless you believe you're going to need it more than once. And that belief had to come from somewhere. From experience. From memory. From events that left enough of an impact that entire generations committed themselves to preparing for the next time. And that's where the usual explanations start to feel incomplete. Yes, the region of Cappadocia saw conflict. Yes, empires rose and fell. Yes, there were raids, invasions, shifting powers. The Hittites, the Persians, the Romans, later groups moving through the region, all of them brought instability. But instability alone doesn't explain this level of preparation. Because instability is unpredictable. It comes and goes. It doesn't usually create a pattern so consistent that people spend centuries building an entire underground network just to respond to it. What this looks like is something expected, something anticipated, something people believed would come back no matter what they did. And that changes the way you look at everything. Because now you're not just asking what they were hiding from. You're asking what they knew, what they had experienced that made them think this was necessary. And this is where the story becomes uncomfortable, because there isn't one clean answer. There are possibilities, theories, fragments of history that line up in certain ways, but never completely. One idea is prolonged warfare, not just raids, but repeated waves of conflict so destructive that the only reliable survival strategy was to disappear completely, to become invisible, to let armies pass overhead without ever finding you. And that explains part of it, but not all of it. Because even the worst conflicts don't usually require people to stay underground for months at a time, generation after generation. Another possibility is environmental disaster. Droughts, harsh winters, events that made the surface temporarily unlivable. And again, that fits in some ways. But if the problem is environmental, you adapt on the surface. You move. You change how you farm. You don't necessarily build 18 levels underground unless the surface itself becomes consistently unsafe. And then there's the idea we touched on earlier. Disease. Something that spreads. Something invisible. Something that can't be fought directly. Something that turns normal life into a risk. Because if water sources become contaminated, if entire communities fall sick, if the danger is something you can't see or stop easily, then isolation becomes the only option. Complete isolation. Cutting yourself off entirely. And in that context, the design of Derinkuyu starts to make more sense. The protected water, the sealed doors, the segmented layout, the ability to quarantine sections if needed. The idea that you could live below the surface until whatever was happening above had passed. But even that doesn't fully explain the scale, because the scale suggests something more. Something that wasn't just occasional. Something that justified expanding this place over centuries, improving it, maintaining it, keeping it ready. And that's the part that lingers. Because whatever the reason was, it had to be strong enough to shape behavior across generations. Strong enough that people didn't abandon this system once things improved. Strong enough that they kept it ready, just in case. Just in case it happened again. And that's where the silence in the historical record becomes noticeable. Because we have writings from ancient civilizations. We have records of wars, of rulers, of trade, of disasters. But we don't have a clear, direct explanation for something like this. Not in a way that matches the scale and complexity of what was built. Which means either it wasn't recorded clearly, or the records didn't survive, or whatever it was didn't fit neatly into the way people wrote about the world. And that leaves us with the physical evidence. The city itself, the only thing that remains. And the city says one thing very clearly. They were preparing. Constantly. Carefully. And they were serious about it. Because this isn't half finished. It isn't abandoned mid-construction. It's complete. Functional. Used. Maintained. It worked. For centuries. People went down there. Closed the doors. Lived their lives in darkness. Waited. And then, when it was safe, they came back up. And then, at some point later, they did it again. And again. Until eventually, for reasons we don't fully understand, they stopped. Maybe the threat changed. Maybe it disappeared. Maybe society evolved in ways that made this kind of preparation unnecessary. Or maybe people simply forgot. Forgot why it was built. Forgot how often it had been needed. Forgot what it felt like to depend on it. And over time, the entrances were sealed. The tunnels hidden. The city beneath the ground slowly fading from memory until it became nothing more than a rumor, a possibility, something buried beneath layers of history. Until one day, in 1963, someone knocked down a wall and found it again. And that's where we are now, standing at the edge of something we can see, we can measure, we can walk through, but we can't fully explain. A city built underground, not just for shelter, but for survival on a scale that feels extreme, even by modern standards. A place where people chose darkness over whatever waited above. A place that still works, that still stands, that could still, if needed, serve the same purpose it was built for. And that's the final thought that stays with you. Because the question isn't just what they were hiding from. It's whether the reason they built this is something we've already forgotten, or something we've never fully understood. And the answer to that might be buried just as deep as the city itself.